Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I am your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you doing?
I am doing well, thanks. It's good to share the airwaves here at TDF again with Gerbrandt, whom I haven't shared the waves with since returning, and it's good to be back. The only risk is now I'm going to be compared to him, and I'll come up intellectually short, and physically short. But I mean, that's the way of the world, I guess.
And of course, we're also joined by Gerbrandt van Heerden. Gerry, how are you doing?
I'm a happy floating talking head at the moment. I don't know if you guys can see my shoulders.
Only just.
White wall. Yeah.
No, I like it. It gives a sort of mystical element to the YouTube. All right. So, speaking of weird things going on, things are coming to a bit of a head in Cape Town, it seems. Santaco, the taxi organization, and is still continuing with its strike against the city of Cape Town. The origination of this dispute is that the city of Cape Town passed new bylaws that would allow it to immediately impound vehicles, as they said that fines were not working in getting people to obey the law. This has prompted very severe backlash from taxi drivers, taxi owners, and we've seen, unfortunately, not just the blockading of roads and the strike preventing people from being able to get to school and to work, etc., but also quite a lot of violence. Lots of trucks and buses burned, a fair amount of chaos across the city, a large number of arrests of people who have allegedly been engaging in some of these activities. Particularly targeted has been the Golden Arrow bus service, which actually got an urgent interim interdict against Santaco after some of their buses were torched. Santaco basically says, "Look, it's nothing to do with us. We told everyone to obey the law. It's rogue elements," and they say that they have nothing to do with any of the violence. I think someone's been shot in the leg. I think someone was killed, a LEAP officer, which is basically a local law enforcement officer in the Western Cape. So really bad stuff. 27 schools were forced to shut down. And I think something like more than 50 people have been arrested at this point. The city of Cape Town did go and get a court interdict against Santaco's strike, saying that the court interdict prohibits people, vehicles, taxis, and drivers from blockading public roads in a manner that may cause traffic delays. It also further states that no person may approach within 100 meters of any transportation depot within the Cape Metropole, and no person may interfere with the operations of any transportation depot. So the city has also gone on to say that they can't basically give in to Santaco's demands now, because if they did so, it would legitimize this kind of violence and behavior. Herman, let me start with you. Firstly, I just want to say, as a kind of a bit of an aside, it's always a little bit sad to me when an organization goes and gets a court interdict to prevent something that's already illegal. Burning buses is already illegal, but the Golden Arrow bus company still felt the need that it needed to go and get a court interdict. I'm not really sure what that does, but it's just it's depressing, because you don't need a court interdict that's already illegal. What do you make of this? I think I pretty much agree with the city statement here that regardless of whether their sort of approach to this was correct from the beginning, if you back down now, it'll legitimize a whole way of interacting with politics that has been the norm, I think, in lots of South Africa for far too long. And it is profoundly corrosive to the health and stability of our democracy. What do you make of this?
Absolutely. It is. It comes down to negotiating with terrorists, in the sense that if you start giving in to demands, hostage taking, ransom seeking becomes profitable, and it becomes at least solid leverage to be a means to a similar situation faced the UK in the 70s, when they had the labor unions, from the grave digging union to the teachers union to the mine workers union to the printers union to every union under the sun had this situation where it was like the First World War. If one of them went on strike, the whole lot of them were bound to go on strike. And it created this conflict of vested interests versus essentially the rest of society. And South Africa is in a similar situation in principle, but I think we are far deeper in the muck. And we see this on a few fronts. We see it now with the taxi sector industry that has grown so aggressive and powerful that even during the most draconian periods in lockdown, it felt enabled and confident enough to simply ignore state instructions and state regulations. Now, as stupid as those were, it is quite telling when your government steps up its control and turns up the volume on that button to 11, and still you have a sector in your society saying, how about no? So number one, we've got a very muscular, aggressive, and powerful taxi mafia industry group of vested interests there. Along the same lines, we look at the municipal workers' strike in Tshwane, where another group of vested interest are setting themselves up against, firstly, reality, and secondly, the rest of society, that Tshwane ratepayers cannot afford a raise, but yet now we're in this Mexican standoff where if the government blinks, then negotiations with terrorists will pay. Not that I'm calling them terrorists, but the principle of leverage and coercive leverage applies. And then you also have the Zama Zamas, where a few weeks ago on this show, we discussed an incident where a Zama Zama sort of warlord was then essentially employed by the mining company he was making life difficult for, and it was presented as some sort of success story. The problem is that is giving in to violent coercion to achieve the ends that you cannot get through other legal or peaceful means. And these instances of municipal workers, the taxis and the Zama Zamas, they're just three examples that over the last few months really came to a head in South Africa, where we see state failure over decades, empowering vested interest groups that can essentially expand into an unregulated, lawless sphere, either geographically or in terms of an economic area or function, and operate with no consequence. And then the problem becomes, what do you do if you face these forces? And Thatcher had the advantage that there was an obvious workaround with specifically the coal miners' strike that ultimately broke the back of the labor unions. She could hoard coal so that a strike would not interrupt the rest of the country, as it did in the 1970s when power cuts in the UK forced the 5-week workday to fall to a 3-week workday, and thus slice productivity and income for the whole country. She could use that tactical advantage because it was a resource that was hoardable. In South Africa, how do you break the back of the stranglehold of essentially a violent monopoly like the taxi mafia, like the taxi bosses? Where do you even start untangling that mess, understanding that law, politics, government, private interest, labor, small businesses, and your ordinary South African all have a stake in this and all might have a role to play in turning this around? We are seeing venomous chickens coming home to roost.
Venomous chickens, okay.
So that's my first rap album, by the way.
No, I like that that take quite a lot, Herman. And I think what this really lays bare, and here I want your thoughts on whether you agree with me here, is that, you know, we often say reforming South Africa and fixing its problems is going to be difficult. But I don't think a lot of people have in mind exactly what that looks like. This is what that looks like. You know, I'm not the biggest fan, I will admit, of traffic laws, but it's true that people often, particularly a lot of taxis, don't pay fines or don't follow the rules of the road particularly closely, and that maybe impounding was the only way to deal with them. And that sort of harsh action, and now the response to it, that is the violence and the chaos and the blockading and all of that, that's going to play out in every single sector of the country that it is in urgent need of reform before we get to a place where reform is actually implemented. And that means that the process of fixing South Africa's problems is going to involve probably quite a lot of instability, not just sort of a general upward trajectory of stability. What do you make of that, Ferry?
Yeah, I think, and we touched on this in the previous show last week. Lawlessness has been allowed to, fester throughout South African society without anybody being held accountable. And, with regards to the taxi industry, the national government has for years allowed them to monopolize very important routes without any sort of consequence. So when you try to enforce laws, there's suddenly it's definitely going to lead to the massive violence that we've seen in the last few days. I'm also mindful about the slow response from the police and the fact that Police Minister Bekele was at the location where the strike was declared. And it's interesting that, that we are about less than a year away from a national election. And the ANC, I don't want to be some sort of conspiracy theorist, but the ANC Youth League in the Western Cape have for years stated that they want to render the province, the DA-led province, ungovernable. And maybe this is some sort of indirect tactic from the ANC, either by stoking violence through the taxi industry or just by simply not enacting quickly enough or responding quickly enough to the violence in Cape Town and in the rest of the province. But at worst, this is something that is done maliciously because it is a election year, and at best, it's simply what we're seeing are the results of an incompetent government, a very weak police system that we've had. We've seen confidence in the police consistently decline for over 10 years because they're unable to clamp down on extortionists, mafia-style criminals, and on, controlling the taxi industry. The taxi industry is mighty. Millions and millions of people depend on them, and they can easily hold the economy. They can easily hold it at a stranglehold. So yeah, I think it's just the results of years of neglect of really trying to enforce basic laws.
Hermann, any final thoughts on this before we move on to Eskom?
Yeah, Harry in a show the other day mentioned a very, very worrying statistic explaining how state failure has allowed these sorts of vested interests to become powerful and violent and just, be able to hold us hostage in a way. And that was the decline of passenger journeys by rail from 2008 to 2022. I think, Harry, the figure was something along the lines of 600 million passenger journeys per year in 2008 to 200 million passenger journeys per year. 20 million, my goodness. So that is just an indication of these people didn't stop moving about. Some of them might have, because they literally didn't have access to economic participation. But most of them have gone to alternative means of transport to get to your place of work. And what would that be? Your taxis. So we sit in a situation where 580 million passenger rail journeys might have become the strength of the taxi industry since 2008, because the state's ability to maintain the rail infrastructure left them with nowhere else to go. And now you're a bit in the situation where, you're in debt to a loan shark, and he has a reputation for breaking knees.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to a discussion about Eskom. So the electricity minister, which is, I think, in government, despite the high pay, probably one of the least pleasant jobs, because you have to go out and basically sort of muck about with the unfixable, at least regarding the powers that he's been given. But I don't know, maybe I'm being too generous. But anyway, so Minister Ramakgopa was quite honest in a talk he recently gave about the incredibly high costs of load shedding on the country, talking about sort of hundreds of billions of rands in economic value that have been lost, about the number of jobs which have been lost, which he calculates at about 860,000 in 2023 alone. Never mind all of the other years of load shedding, although, of course, this has been, I believe, by most metrics, the worst year for load shedding already, by far. But quite shockingly, he said that he expects a loss of 77 billion rand in tax earnings in 2023, which is about 5% of the total tax revenue that was taken in 2021-2022 fiscal year, which is obviously a very big blow to the government's finances. He also mentioned that the open cycle gas turbines, which are supposed to be used in emergencies, have been used. They were used to produce 1,352 gigawatt hours of electricity in the same period last year, and this year in that same period they've been almost double, about 80% more use of them, 2,113 gigawatt hours. So in other words, those very expensive emergency only things are being used almost twice as much as they were last year, which does not engender costs. Gerry, what do you make of all this? I mean, that amount of tax revenue, we had just kind of towards the end of the COVID stuff, there was this little boost in tax revenue because of the higher commodity prices, and the mines made a big chunk of profit, which they were able to hand over to the government. And that kind of kept us from falling off, I think, the fiscal cliff we were heading for. But now with a loss like that, it looks kind of like, to me, a lot of these gains of those years will be wiped out. What do you make of this?
Yeah, it is, as you say, Nicholas. South Africa has been lucky in the last few years that, in the sense we are a very mineral-rich country, and with a commodity boom, we do quite well. Government finances get a boost from that. But there are signs that the global investment environment is becoming more risk-averse. And countries such as South Africa, with a very hostile policy environment to business, to investors, it's going to be very difficult on the one hand for South Africa in the next coming years to attract capital. And at the same time, we're also seeing our wealthiest members of society packing their bags and leaving us for better markets, for better investor markets. But the point is that our tax revenue sources are getting several blows from different angles. And then on top of all that, you have our energy utility, which is collapsing, which is using, which is looking at emergency strategies to keep the lights on, which is absolutely unsustainable. And this is going to deal a heavy blow to high energy consumption industries such as the mining industry, the manufacturing industry, that also pay a lot of tax, and the government really benefits from those industries in terms of tax revenue. So once they are unable to to up their profits and up their tax contributions, it's really going to cause a huge vacuum in the government finances. And then at the same time, you have the government that wants to bring in all these massive new projects that's going to cost a lot of money. But where is the money coming from? It's all very unsustainable, and yet there's no real policy reform on the horizon from the government. It's very, very interesting to witness, actually.
So, Herman, if someone from government heard what Kerry just said, they would say, no, but look, we're bringing online all this new capacity through things like wind farms and solar panels and all that kind of stuff, and it's just taking time to procure that electricity. But once it's all in the pipeline and it's coming now, and no one really could have done it faster. But you have a figure which perhaps suggests that's not entirely correct.
Yes, no, I think, firstly, just for some historical context, these warnings of load shedding and capacity of limits of the grid aren't new. I mean, I think all three of us were at school still when those warnings became prevalent, possibly primary school. I think it was towards the late 90s, but by 2007, it was absolutely clear that Eskom couldn't keep up in terms of its grid development or generation capacity.
Right, which is why they built Medupi and Kusile, these two huge new coal power plants. But that didn't solve the problem, partly because they built them so badly and so corruptly.
Yes, because preferential procurement, cadre deployment, BEE, I mean, pick your poison. But the fascinating figure that I saw was reported on in the in Business Tech a few days ago, indicating that, and let me read here, data shows that South African households and businesses have installed an estimated 4,400 megawatt of rooftop solar PV, double the solar capacity procured under Eskom's 4 bid windows. Another fact that I want to put out there in context is I spoke to an analyst the other day who said that over the last year, more generation capacity has been added through businesses and private homes through solar, or at least the equivalent of generation capacity generated by solar panels on residences and businesses over the last year, equivalent to more than a decade of Eskom working for capacity expansion in terms of power generation. And then to put that in a final bit of context, that RMB Morgan Stanley shows that by 2025, private sector power generation will exceed the output from Eskom's entire generation fleet, with Eskom becoming responsible for 47% of the of energy production, and the rest coming from individual private residences and businesses. Now, we are often accused of being ideologues for the free market, irrespective, but it's difficult to fault the fact that when pressure came, the free market responded quicker. And this isn't just in this instance. We can look at the crime wave that started in the 1980s and really broke over the country in the 1990s, That gave rise to the situation that we are now in a country where private security guards outnumber our police forces 5-1.
I think it's closer to 6-1.
Possibly, yeah. At least 5-1. We are in a country where time and again, when a societal problem was faced and the state was found incapable of rising to meet the challenge, private sector actors did so. Are these private sector actors, wonderful angelic beings? No, they are profit chasers. But they are profit chasers who have delivered the services we are willing to pay the profits for. I've got burglar bars on my windows. I've got alarm sensors around my house. I've got a spiky fence. And yet I'm still paying for the police to keep me safe. As a South African, I have made the decision to rather absorb the loss that I pay to the state in terms of my police investment and spend some of my own money after tax to look after responsibilities that should by rights be with the government. The country has done it before, and it is incredible that we are doing it again. And I'm not saying that's a wonderful thing. I'm just showing that if you want a problem solved in record time, it is imbecilic to look to the state to do it. And then we also have the Minister for Electricity, who a few days ago said Eskom grid expansion will be prioritized over the next 10 years. And I'm like, wonderful.
It wasn't prioritized until now.
if only someone had thought about that. And this just all comes down to the fact that I think 3 years ago, Nick, Curry, and the three of us, possibly, and I think France, in a conversation when we still had offices, came to the conclusion, and I might have been other colleagues there as well, but the fact that this country can't grow at more than 2% annually in terms of GDP unless it solves the power crisis. The power crisis is a hard cap on what can be achieved in terms of job and economic growth. And if we look at the loss of 800,000 plus jobs due to load shedding, and we draw a parallel between 1% GDP growth roughly equals 100,000 jobs created, we will need 8% GDP growth on a year-by-year basis to make up for the disaster of Eskom. And I think if there's one thing that we should be critical of civil society, businesses, and local government in South Africa, is next time when we see government failing to deal with a crisis, let's not hedge our bets and hope they will deal with the crisis in time. Be proactive, anticipate the problem of power generation, and the warning, perhaps even now too late, is that the water situation will go a similar route to this. Already now, citizens, businesses, and local governments should be massively investing and exploring alternative sources of water. We've done it with crime and safety and security. We're doing it as a country with electricity. The next frontier will be water security. And if we get fooled again, shame on us.
I think that's also kind of interesting to think about this as in if the government could actually just stop the decline of Eskom, if it could just sort of hold it where it is now, load shedding might end because the private sector is becoming so involved. But we've seen it in the energy availability factor and stuff that it has continued to decline, even as the government says it's desperately trying to bring on new sources of energy.
And it's a vicious cycle because Eskom has run up so much debt. It needs income to pay off its debt, but it can't generate power to sell to get income to pay off its debt. So it's just losing customers. And it takes a special sort of dedication to have a monopoly and make a loss on something like power. That takes skill and commitment.
Indeed. All right. I don't think we really have time for our last story here. So I think I'm going to call it to a close. But it won't be a show tomorrow because it is, of course, Women's Day. And so I hope everyone enjoys the day off. And with that, all I can say is thank you very much for listening. We hope you found this interesting, and we will see you on Thursday for for a Daily Friend wrap show in the afternoon. Everyone, have a wonderful public holiday. Cheers.